One of the things that I know about Revelation is that it has been co-opted. It has been co-opted for maybe the past 100 years or so, particularly by fundamentalist Christians and far-right evangelicals who take those codes in Revelation and think that they apply to things happening right now or in our time. That it's all about these actual events that are happening, that even now we're in the midst of what the book of Revelation is talking about. I have a friend who grew up in absolute terror that she would be left behind, that was going to happen to her because of the way that people around her were interpreting Revelation specifically. The theologian Elizabeth Schussler Fiorenza talks about these kinds of interpretations as paranoid fantasies. She says this: sometimes something very strange happens when this text is appropriated by readers in a comfortable, powerful majority community. It becomes a gold mine for paranoid fantasies and for those who want to preach revenge and destruction. But just like the rest of the Bible, which we can read from and learn from, even though it was written to and about people thousands of years ago, the book of Revelation is also written to a very specific community and about very specific events that were happening. It's not a prophecy or a prediction in the sense that it's saying this is something that's going to happen in the future. It's revealing. It's uncovering the truths of things that are happening in the world as it is 2,000 years ago. The problem is, at least for us, is that just as I talked about in the lesson for all ages, it's written in the language of dreams and codes, and there's such a long distance between us and the language that it was written in and the time that it was written in, that it's hard to decode that language. It's hard to decode those dreams and all of the images that are happening in Revelation. The word apocalypse is used most often in our contemporary English to mean the end of the world. And the reason that we use the word apocalypse is because of the ways that Revelation has been used, because the original word for Revelation is apocalypse, apocalypsis in Greek. So like very, very similar sounding. And so the revelation of John is the apocalypsis of John, because John has had a revelation, like John has had a dream. Something has been revealed to the author of this book. Like he's seeing something in a new way. It's connected to the idea of unveiling. So like in a traditional wedding where a bride wears a veil, where she's unveiled after the ceremony, and the groom and the community can see the truth and beauty of this new spouse. So it's an unveiling the truth and beauty of the situation as it is. One of the professors that I listened to, as I was reading about Revelation this week, when he talks to his students about it, he likens it to the Matrix. So in the Matrix, the movie The Matrix, which I hope is enough part of the cultural conversation by now that we at least have an idea about that, those who take the blue pill, I think, I haven't seen it for years and years, but the idea is that there's a whole reality that people are unaware of because everything's just in the minds. They're going along as if everything is as it is, but it's all a simulation. And if they take the blue pill, then all of that is revealed. That all of that the falsehood falls away and you can see the truth. And that's what this professor likens it to with his students, that now we can see the truth of the violence and the corruption and can resist it. And I'm starting to see, when I was reading about this, I was like, oh, now I can maybe see why some of my seminary colleagues were like super obsessed with The Matrix 20 years ago when I was in seminary. That there are lots of, I think people do see lots of like theological themes in that movie. So we read the whole first chapter, read or heard the whole first chapter today. And this first chapter is set up for the whole rest of the book. where we learn who the audience is. We learn a little bit more about John. So far, it's like not super weird. So we're going to get into this context setting. The author John, and this is not the same John from the Gospels or who wrote the book of John. There are just lots of people named John at the time. He's known as John of Patmos because he was exiled to this small island, apparently because he had been very outspoken about Jesus and about the gospel, and he'd begun to be perceived as a threat to the people who were in power, which is like something we see time after time in the gospel, first with Jesus and his apostles, and then with Paul as he's preaching the gospel. John had begun to be a threat. And one author that I read speculated that perhaps John had refused to participate in worship at an imperial shrine where people were swearing allegiance to Caesar, and he refused to swear allegiance to anyone but Jesus. And one of the themes in Revelation is the corruption and the violence of the empire ruled by Caesar. The church is being called to resist the impulse to become like the empire that's ruling them. John talks about sharing hardship and endurance with the churches. And it's possible that some of the churches were being persecuted for their beliefs, persecuted for following Christ. But it's just as likely that John is talking about how genuinely difficult it is to live in the tension between the lure of power and hierarchy and privilege that comes along with following the way of empire, and the knowing that like closeness to empire can bring power and wealth, and that using the means of empire like violence and exploitation that can give you good things. So the tension between that and the life and liberation and justice and love brought by Jesus, the human one, who we see represented in this chapter. And I mean, even though this was written 2,000 years ago, or almost 2,000 years ago, it was probably written around the year 90. That tension, that feels really familiar to me. The tension between knowing that I could just forget about doing justice and loving mercy and walking humbly with God, and I could cozy up to the people who have power and count on my privilege to insulate me. It is hard. It is a hardship to continue to follow Jesus into the way of peace and love. The churches that John is writing to are in present-day Turkey. And some of those names might sound familiar because Paul also wrote to those churches to encourage them, to offer advice and criticism and encouragement. And it's the fact that this was written to churches that really makes me want to hang in there with it. The fact that it was written to groups of people who are trying their best to follow Jesus in a world that is hard to follow Jesus. That makes me want to hang in there with Revelation and figure it out, kind of in the same way that even though I don't like everything about Paul, I still hang in there because it's about these communities of believers who are working together to try to discern what it is to follow Jesus. Plus, I like a challenge and I kind of like a puzzle, and Revelation is a puzzle. And I appreciate the ways of understanding and expressing who God is and how God works in the world that are a different language from the way I think about it. That doesn't make it wrong. I think there are folks, and particularly I would say even folks who have a much more evangelical outlook than mine. I appreciate when I go to, say, like conferences like I'm going to go to this week, where people who have a different language for how they express their faith, even though it's not mine, I really appreciate having those kinds of, like, those multiple ways of seeing within the church. And that challenges my faith in a new way. And Revelation is kind of like that for me. And there is an Anabaptist precedent for apocalyptic, or that like revealing kind of visionary expression for God's work in the world. So around the time when Anabaptism was born 500 years ago, there was a woman named Ursula Jost and her husband, and they had several other people in their community with them. They began to have and to share these visions, kind of like what John was experiencing. Ursula and her community began to experience these visions and share them that were meant to encourage and exhort the early Anabaptist community, who, similar to the first Christians, were having this experience of, we're beginning to understand Christ and what it means to follow Jesus in a way that's very dissonant and different with what the kings and princes and powers of the world and even the established church are having. And so Ursula and her community were having these visions, and they were shared. Ursula was not literate, but Melchior Hoffman, who was another Anabaptist thinker and leader, he wrote down her visions. There were 70 of them altogether in a couple of different books, and they were shared throughout these like new sprouting up Anabaptist communities, which in the same way were encouraging people to be steadfast, to continue to follow Jesus, to resist alignment with the empires of their time. This kind of literature, it's not prophetic in the sense that this is literally what's going to happen sense, but it could be considered prophetic in the same way that some of the biblical prophets speak truth to power or name the truth in calling us to our allegiance to Christ. The way that John addresses this book to the churches of his time makes me think about how when something happens, when something kind of crisis happens in the nation, or something happens that causes us to sort of shake the foundations of our faith leaders will write a letter to our churches to say, we're thinking of you, hold fast. And so, for example, this is not a one-to-one parallel, obviously, but in these last months during the Trump administration, when it's been revealed how more and more unjust and corrupt our own political leaders are, our Mennonite church leaders have written to pastors saying, continue to resist the violence, be a place of welcome, be a place of sanctuary. And I can imagine we're going to hear a lot more of that message in the week to come. But maybe more, the thing that the letter in particular that I thought of, which while it's not apocalyptic in the nature of the writing, it is a vision, a dream Martin Luther King wrote when he was jailed in Birmingham. And I'm sure many of you have read letters from a Birmingham jail by Martin Luther King, in which he unveils or names the truth of the empire's racist ideology. And he's writing to the church, specifically to white, moderate Christians, challenging them in their succumbing to that prevailing ideology, that we can wait, just hold your horses. And King reminds them that the injustice that they're allowing to continue by simply asking him to be patient is another day of injustice for all people, challenging them to be bold in their resistance, that waiting and being patient with injustice is just allowing that domination system to win, that system of violence and racism to win. So in the coming weeks, of looking at Revelation, we're going to get way more bizarre. And like I said earlier, we're going to have the next time we preach in 2 weeks, the next time I preach, we're going to hear about the dragon and the beasts and 666. And I'm looking forward to doing some of that decoding together and figuring it out with all of you. Because like I said, it's been a minute since I've read this, and I think it's going to be fun.